Also, lawmakers hoping the certainty of an April 2nd announcement on tariffs will alleviate consumer anxiety. Here with more, Veda Partners co-founder and director of economic policy, Henrietta Treyz. Henrietta, I suggest you have a bridge you'd like to sell people if they think that certainty is coming on April 2nd. I know you've been watching this really closely. You've been talking to so many people in Washington. What are we going to learn on April 2nd, and what happens then?
I think on April 2nd, well, really April 1st, when we see the release from USTR Greer and the Commerce Secretary and the Treasury Secretary about every single piece of the trade landscape that President Trump intends to delve into for the next 4 years. What I'm most concerned about, obviously, is the tariffs that are going to be implemented day of. I think that's going to be things like tariffs on automobiles, specifically with the European Union. I'm very concerned about the broad scope that was proposed in his executive order last night. I also think that we're going to see some determinations that China is in violation of their phase one trade agreement. So tariffs across the Section 301 list could all rise from their 25% and 7.5% rates. But I think what's going to be really pernicious is the announcement about new investigations. Because as we know, once you provide the backbone of the rationale for tariffs, like a Section 301 investigation into China, those tariffs are sticky and they only get higher. The China tariffs have been in place now for 7 years across 2 administrations. So I think the market is going to have a lot to digest, and they're going to see just how forward-looking and long-term these tariffs are, which is not currently priced in.
Henrietta, we know Trump loves tariffs, of course. I'm just curious, when you're on Capitol Hill and you're talking to Republican lawmakers right now about tariffs, what are they telling you?
They're telling me that they think that the tariffs are impacting the market only because they're uncertain. And as soon as we have clarity, it's 80-20, 80% of the market reaction. And today's, 700-point decline is because of the uncertainty generated by tariffs, not the economic impact of tariffs. There's another view that the tariffs are really not going to be on for that long. But the staff is almost talking to you like they're hopeful. But there's not a pathway for them to really go to USTA and USTR and say, hey, I need an exclusion. And so when you talk to trade associations, they're very concerned because they are already tariffed and they don't have a pathway to prove either that they're USMCA compliant, to guarantee that their provision shouldn't be tariffed at the border. And there's just a lot of confusion. So Republican staff is, I think, really pushing this to the side as the president takes his decisions unilaterally.
So many market participants we've spoken with, Henrietta, still say they see tariffs and President Trump's use of tariffs as a negotiating tool. Do you still think that, or maybe you never did, do you think that's the case? Do you think that's the wrong way to frame this?
There are 20% tariffs on $489 billion worth of goods coming in from China, on top of the 25% tariffs that he imposed 7 years ago. No, this is not a negotiation. And let's maybe take it a little bit further. If you do enter into negotiations with other nations, those negotiations take years. We reached a phase one trade deal with China in 2020, and there is still no adherence. After the tariffs go into effect, you don't just need the countries, say the EU, to come into the room with you and begin negotiations. You need to reach the end of the negotiation and then have them prove that they've delivered on whatever it is that you've asked them to do. That takes a tremendous amount of time. I think the EU auto tariffs, for example, are going to be in effect for a minimum of 6 months. 12 months is entirely possible. And should we run into different issues on the digital services tax or agriculture trade, it'll just continue to expand.
Henrietta, I had a political question for you as well, which is that, you think about Trump's GOP, Henrietta, it's a different kind of GOP. It's a different kind of coalition. He's brought in more, it's blue-collar Americans and working-class Americans. The extent that you see these tariffs and they raise prices for these folks, how loyal do you think they remain to Trump, and for how long?
There's some really interesting polling data about all of the president's agenda, the immigration issues, deportations, even the tax bill and tariffs. And tariffs consistently rank as the lowest area of support amongst his voters. So while they are behind him and 83% of the population thinks that China is a major threat to the United States, we are not unclear about the fact that tariffs are taxes. The American public knows that. So when President Trump comes out and says this is Liberation Day and, tariffs are a tax cut, you can see from the consumer data that is coming out right now that the American public is not buying what he's selling on this specific topic. So I do think it's an interesting area of disconnect. And on Tuesday, the Democratic conference in the United States Senate is actually going to force a vote. They just announced this about an hour ago. They're going to force a vote on the IEEPA tariffs against Canada and get all the Republican senators on the record either supporting or opposing the IEEPA tariffs that Trump has put on at 25% rates against Canada. And that's going to be fascinating. That'll happen on Tuesday.
So, Henrietta, the other thing that's been fascinating about this Trump term versus the last Trump term is even when there were things like tariffs, he would also try to present other things that his constituents would be happier about, a tax cut, for example. Right now, you got the tariffs, you got chest beating about Greenland, which I don't think a lot of voters are super excited about, I think safe to say. And where is the good news? You know, where is the stuff that we're transitioning to? Where are the maybe tax cut extension? You know, how are you thinking about how the administration is approaching these questions and whether they care, whether how they're thinking about them?
I think that's a really critical question. So we talk a lot about the tax bill that Congress is writing right now. It's a minimum of $5 trillion. All of which will be deficit financed. And they're not passing a tax cut to help the consumer, whether the soaring egg prices or the potential for tariffs on lumber, which will drive home building costs up even higher, or the new tariffs on back to school items like a backpack or a bicycle. It's literally everything that's being tariffed. And so you're looking for some sort of relief. You were mentioning Brooke Rollins before, the USDA secretary. They're already talking about providing a bailout for farmers in anticipation of something we haven't even talked about, which is the retaliatory tariffs that other nations are going to put on us. So it's not just that the tariffs are passed on to U.S. consumers when they're collected coming into the U.S. It's also that all the goods that we are exporting are going to be tariffed and have a problem leaving the country. So those farmers or any manufacturers trying to ship things overseas are going to see either boycotts like we've seen in Canada or higher tariff rates as we've seen in Europe and China. And those are real pernicious problems. And there are no tax cuts in the bill that they're writing right now.
Henrietta, do you think ultimately the possibilities here, would we just extend the expiring tax cuts, or do you think that we'd also see new tax cuts?
We are working on extending the existing tax rates. I do not expect any material reduction in individual tax rates whatsoever. At the best, what we can hope for is a fix to the SALT cap. I think that has to happen for members like Mike Lawler in New York who have ambitions for statewide office. There's going to have to fix there. Of course, that only benefits a certain segment of the population. It disproportionately skews to the wealthy. We do also want to extend a child tax credit. But again, it's just an extension of the status quo. The reality is the 2017 tax cuts were too expensive to make permanent, and therefore they expire. So the alternative, and what is happening right now, is we either raise taxes through inaction, or we act and it's so expensive that all we can really do is keep things where they are, flat. So you have increased tariffs, which are taxes, and no commensurate tax cuts, just an extension of the status quo.
Henrietta, I hope you're getting lots of rest, doing good stuff for yourself this weekend, because boy, you're going to be busy next week.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot. I'm excited.
Yeah, as are we all. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate your time.